The Xarnak were a peaceful species, known throughout the galaxy for their incredible technological advancements and deep connection to nature. Their homeworld was a beautiful place, full of lush jungles, rivers that glittered like silver, and cities that blended harmoniously with the environment. But there was a darkness creeping over their world, a terrifying invader that threatened to destroy everything they had built. The Torag, a brutal and war-hungry race, had set their sights on the Xarnak homeworld. With their powerful war machines and unyielding drive for conquest, the Torag began tearing through Xarnak cities, leaving devastation in their wake. The Xarnak fought back with all their might, but their fragile biology and weaker combat skills were no match for the relentless Torag. The invaders had the upper hand, and the Xarnak were running out of time. In a desperate last attempt to save their people, the Xarnak did the only thing they could think of. They sent a message into the stars, hoping against hope that someone would hear it. It was a distress call, simple but urgent. We need help. The Torag are coming. We cannot survive alone. They sent the message in every known language, every known frequency. They needed a force strong enough to stand against the Torag, and fast. The message echoed across the galaxy, reaching far and wide, through systems that were hundreds of light years away. It was picked up by human ears on Earth, specifically by the United Earth Defense Corps, UEDC, the military force that protected humanity's interests across the stars. The UEDC was just beginning to explore deep space, but they had dealt with plenty of threats on their own homeworld. When the UEDC received the Xarnak's distress signal, they saw an opportunity, a chance to show the galaxy that humanity was a force to be reckoned with. The Xarnak had asked for help, and the UEDC knew exactly who could answer that call. The Deathworlders. They were humanity's elite soldiers, warriors trained to survive in the harshest conditions imaginable. These men and women had been born and raised on planets where the very environment itself could kill you. Deathworlders were the survivors of worlds with extreme weather, savage beasts, and hostile ecosystems. They had adapted to thrive where others could not, and they had become the ultimate soldiers in the process. The UEDC gathered a group of Deathworlders and prepared them for their mission. They would travel to the Xarnak homeworld, assess the situation, and, if necessary, take action. The message from the Xarnak was clear. They needed a force strong enough to fight the Torag and save their people. As the Deathworlders boarded their ship and prepared to leave Earth, they were focused, determined, and ready. They knew what they had to do. The Torag wouldn't know what hit them. The Deathworlders were coming, and they would deliver victory. The journey to the Xarnak homeworld was long, but the Deathworlders didn't mind. They were used to harsh conditions, and a journey through deep space was nothing compared to the deadly environments they had faced on their home planets. As the UEDC ship cut through the blackness of space, the soldiers readied themselves for what awaited them. They knew that the Xarnak were counting on them, and they couldn't afford to fail. When the ship finally entered the Xarnak system and approached their homeworld, the Deathworlders stood at the observation windows, looking down at the lush green planet below. It was beautiful, too beautiful to be threatened by something like the Torag. But the Xarnak had warned them. The Torag were brutal, unstoppable in their quest for conquest, and the planet was on the edge of destruction. As they landed, the Deathworlders could feel the weight of the mission ahead of them. The planet was full of dangers, predatory creatures, venomous plants, and weather that could change on a dime. But the Deathworlders were undeterred. They thrived in such conditions, and they were ready for whatever the Xarnak's world could throw at them. The Xarnak greeted them as they disembarked from their ship, their leaders standing at the forefront, their faces a mix of hope and exhaustion. The Deathworlders could see the fear in their eyes. The Xarnak had been fighting for so long, and they were losing. The Torag had come in full force, and their cities were falling one by one. "We didn't know who else to call," one of the Xarnak leaders said, her voice filled with desperation. "You are our last hope." The Deathworlders listened quietly. They didn't need much information to know what was at stake. They had faced overwhelming enemies before, and they had always come out on top. But this time, it wasn't just about survival. It was about saving an entire species from extinction. As the Deathworlders began to set up their base camp, they saw the devastation the Torag had left behind. There were wrecked Sarnak cities, buildings burned to the ground, and the bodies of fallen soldiers scattered across the land. It was clear that the Sarnak were fighting a losing battle. But the Deathworlders didn't see defeat. They saw opportunity. The Torag had underestimated the Sarnak, and now they had underestimated the Deathworlders. The team's leader, Captain Rena, gathered her soldiers together. "We're here to win, not just survive," she said, her voice steady and calm. "We'll show the Torag that they made a big mistake by coming here. We'll fight them with everything we've got." The Deathworlders knew that the Torag wouldn't go down easily. They had heard stories of their brutal tactics and advanced weapons, but they also knew that the Torag were not ready for what humanity could bring to the battlefield. The Deathworlders had a unique advantage: adaptability. No matter how strong or dangerous the Torag seemed, the Deathworlders would find a way to overcome them. The team's first priority was to meet with the Sarnak leaders and assess the situation. They needed to understand the full extent of the Torag threat and determine the best course of action. The Deathworlders couldn't afford to waste any time. Every moment counted, and the Torag were getting closer. As the Deathworlders set out to strategize with the Sarnak, they couldn't help but feel a sense of purpose. The mission was clear: save the Sarnak and take the fight to the Torag. They were ready to give everything to ensure victory. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was a battle for the future of a species that had no choice but to trust humanity, and the Deathworlders wouldn't let them down. The Deathworlders wasted no time. After gathering intelligence and speaking with the Sarnak leaders, they knew the Torag weren't far off. The enemy had set up camp on the outskirts of a small Sarnak city that was still holding out. It was their first target, and the Deathworlders were determined to strike before the Torag could break through the city's defenses. Captain Rena and her team moved out at dawn, slipping through the dense jungle with stealth that would have amazed any other soldier. The air was thick with humidity, and the sounds of alien creatures filled the atmosphere. The Sarnak had warned them about the dangerous wildlife, but the Deathworlders had trained on planets far worse. The jungle was just another obstacle to overcome. "Stay sharp," Rena whispered as they advanced. "We don't know how many Torag are in there, so keep your eyes open." The team spread out, using the dense foliage to stay hidden. They had learned quickly that the Torag relied on heavy firepower and technology, but lacked the ability to adapt to the unpredictable conditions of the Sarnak homeworld. The Deathworlders' greatest strength was their ability to turn anything to their advantage, and the planet's dangerous creatures would be part of the plan. After an hour of moving quietly through the jungle, the Deathworlders arrived at the outskirts of the Torag camp. From their hidden positions, they could see the enemy's large war machines, massive armored vehicles that could level entire buildings. But the Torag were complacent, not expecting an attack from the jungle itself. They were too focused on their mission to notice the humans slipping closer. Rena signaled to her team. The time had come. In perfect coordination, the Deathworlders moved in. They used their advanced tech to disable the Torag's communications, preventing them from calling reinforcements. The first wave of Deathworlders charged forward, with weapons raised and faces set in fierce determination. The Torag were caught completely off guard. They fired back, but their weapons were designed for open combat, not jungle warfare. The Deathworlders moved too fast, too unpredictably. They darted from cover to cover, hitting the Torag where it hurt. Private Cade, one of the most experienced Deathworlders, led the charge. He had survived the most brutal of combat on a desert world filled with constant dust storms and giant sandworms. Now, in the lush Sarnak jungle, he was in his element. He took out the first Torag soldier with a quick shot to the chest and moved on without hesitation. The Deathworlders had learned fast. They used the planet's dangerous creatures to their advantage, luring several of the larger predators into the Torag camp. The massive creatures attacked with vicious speed, tearing through the Torag soldiers and throwing the enemy into disarray. It was chaos, pure and simple, and the Deathworlders thrived in it. The battle was fierce, but the Deathworlders were unstoppable. Their weapons were a combination of high-tech firearms and close combat tools that made them lethal at any range. They moved like ghosts in the jungle, using the environment to disorient and trap the Torag. Every corner they turned, every shadow they moved through, worked to their advantage. By the end of the skirmish, the Torag were retreating. The Deathworlders had taken the enemy by surprise and dealt them a crushing blow. The battle had been quick, brutal, and efficient, and it had sent a powerful message to the Torag. The Deathworlders were not to be underestimated. As the Deathworlders stood victorious over the fallen Torag soldiers, Captain Rena surveyed the scene with a satisfied smile. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We've proven they can bleed. Now, we'll make sure they know what it feels like to lose." The victory at the Torag outpost was only the beginning. The Deathworlders had delivered their first strike, but the Torag were far from defeated. In fact, the Torag were now more furious than ever. The small victory they had lost to the Deathworlders was an insult they could not ignore. They quickly regrouped, bringing in reinforcements and stronger forces. They were prepared to escalate the war, bringing everything they had to bear on the Xarnak and their new human allies. The Deathworlders knew the Torag would retaliate hard, but they were ready. Captain Rena gathered her team and the Xarnak leaders to plan their next move. The Xarnak had been fighting for so long, but they had lost faith in their own ability to turn the tide. It was clear now. They needed the Deathworlders, not just as warriors, but as strategists and experts in fighting enemies who didn't play by the rules. "We can't wait for them to come to us," Rena said, her voice steady and full of resolve. "We need to keep hitting them. We'll use their overconfidence against them." The Deathworlders had become experts in guerrilla tactics during their time on Earth, training in environments that pushed them to their limits. They had faced enemies that far outnumbered them, and they had always found a way to survive. In the jungle of Sarnak, they now had the perfect playing field. Rena's plan was simple: hit the Torag where it would hurt most. They would target supply lines, communication hubs, and any weak points they could find. The Deathworlders didn't have the luxury of a full-scale battle right now, but they didn't need one. They could take down the Torag bit by bit, demoralizing them until they were nothing more than a shadow of their former strength. The first target was a supply convoy that had been making its way through the jungle. The Deathworlders laid a trap, using the thick foliage and dangerous wildlife to set up an ambush. They waited for hours, silent and patient, as the Torag convoy slowly approached. As soon as the Torag vehicles came into view, the Deathworlders sprang into action. They disabled the vehicles with precision strikes, cutting off the enemy's ability to communicate and reinforce. Then the jungle erupted into chaos as they launched their attack, moving faster than the Torag could react. The Torag soldiers, trained for open combat, were confused and disoriented in the dense jungle. Their technology was powerful, but it couldn't keep up with the relentless assault of the Deathworlders. The Deathworlders fought with ferocity, using their superior agility and knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver the Torag. In just a few short hours, the convoy was destroyed, and the Deathworlders had taken several prisoners, giving them valuable intel about the Torag's next move. Rena smiled grimly as she looked over the wreckage. "This is only the beginning," she muttered. "We'll bleed them dry." The Torag had underestimated humanity. They thought they could crush the Xarnak with ease, but they hadn't counted on the Deathworlders, a species that had learned to survive and thrive in the most unforgiving conditions imaginable. Now, every strike they made was a blow to the Torag's morale. With each victory, the Deathworlders proved that they were a force the Torag could not simply wipe out. The war had escalated, but the Deathworlders were not backing down. They would keep fighting until the last Torag was driven from Sarnak soil. The Torag had made one mistake by underestimating humanity, and that mistake would cost them everything. The Deathworlders had already proven they could defeat the Torag in direct combat, but Captain Rena knew that to truly win, they needed more than just brute force. The Torag were relentless and would eventually overwhelm them if they didn't think smarter. The Deathworlders were used to fighting in difficult and dangerous environments, and this planet was no exception. What the Torag didn't understand was that the jungle of Tarnak itself could be a weapon. "We need to use everything at our disposal," Rena said, addressing her team. "The jungle, the wildlife, the terrain, it's all part of the fight now. We've got the advantage because we're prepared to fight here. They're not." The Deathworlders set to work, studying the planet's ecosystem. The jungle of Sarnak wasn't just thick with trees and vines. It was alive with deadly creatures. There were giant predatory insects, enormous reptiles, and even larger, more dangerous beasts that roamed the jungle. The Torag, with all their technology and firepower, had no way to deal with these creatures. They were trained for warfare, not the unpredictable, wild environment that the Deathworlders had learned to survive in. Private Cade, who had spent years on a desert planet filled with giant sandworms and sandstorms, took charge of the operation. He had a natural instinct for turning an environment to his advantage. "We'll use the wildlife. Let's turn the jungle into their worst nightmare." The team began to set up traps, simple but deadly. They used their knowledge of the terrain and the local fauna to lure the most dangerous creatures of the jungle into the paths the Torag would take. The Deathworlders used pheromone-based traps to draw the creatures in, leading them straight into the path of the enemy. Meanwhile, Rena and the rest of the team continued to train with the Xarnak, teaching them guerrilla tactics. The Xarnak, though technologically advanced, had little experience in the kind of hit-and-run warfare the Deathworlders excelled at. The Deathworlders showed them how to use the jungle to their advantage, how to stay hidden, how to move quickly, and how to strike without warning. Soon, the Xarnak warriors were moving like shadows through the jungle, silently stalking their prey. They would ambush the Torag convoys, disrupting their operations and slowing their advance. But the real shock came when the Deathworlders began to use the jungle's creatures against the invaders. One night, a large group of Torag soldiers moved through the jungle, unaware of the dangers waiting for them. The Deathworlders had placed several creatures, massive, lizard-like predators, along the Torag's path. The creatures were highly territorial, and when the Torag soldiers ventured too close, they attacked with terrifying speed. The Torag were caught completely off guard. Their advanced weaponry couldn't help them against the creatures, and their heavy armor was no match for the beast's powerful jaws. The Deathworlders took advantage of the chaos, moving in quickly to finish the job. Within hours, the Torag soldiers had been scattered, and their convoy was in ruins. Rena stood at the edge of the battlefield, watching the Torag retreat in panic. "They don't know what hit them," she said with a cold smile. "They thought they could conquer this planet, but they've never faced anything like us." With each successful ambush, the Deathworlders sent a clear message to the Torag. They were no longer the hunters. The Deathworlders were. The jungle, with all its dangers and hidden threats, had become their ally. And the Torag were learning the hard way that there was no fighting on this planet without facing its wild, unpredictable fury. As the Deathworlders set up for their next strike, Rena felt the weight of the war on her shoulders. But she also knew that every step they took brought them closer to victory. The Torag had come to conquer, but they were being outsmarted at every turn. The Deathworlders had not only adapted to the planet, they had become one with it. And the Torag would soon learn that nothing could stand against them. The war had reached a critical moment. The Deathworlders had successfully crippled the Torag supply lines, disrupted their operations, and even turned the jungle's dangerous wildlife into a deadly weapon. The Torag, once confident in their overwhelming strength, were now forced into retreat after retreat. But despite their losses, they had not given up. They were more determined than ever to crush the Tarnak and their human allies. Captain Rena knew the Torag would soon bring everything they had to bear. They would launch a full-scale assault, and the Deathworlders had to be ready. But she also knew that the Torag weren't just fighting for conquest, they were fighting for survival. This was no longer a simple invasion. It was a battle of wills. The Deathworlders, however, were not like any army the Torag had ever faced. They had learned to adapt to the planet's harsh conditions and use them to their advantage. They were ready for the Torag's final push. "We need to strike first," Rena said as she gathered her team. "We can't let them regroup. If we can hit them hard enough, we can break their will to fight." The Deathworlders set out to launch one final operation, one that would cripple the Torag once and for all. Their target was the Torag's command center, a heavily fortified base deep in the jungle. It was a risky move, but if they could take it down, the Torag would lose their ability to coordinate their forces and would be thrown into disarray. The plan was simple but dangerous. They would infiltrate the base under the cover of darkness, using the jungle's thick foliage and the Torag's overconfidence to sneak past their defenses. Once inside, they would destroy the command center and leave before the Torag could mount a counterattack. As night fell, the Deathworlders moved out. They moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, slipping through the jungle unnoticed. The Torag had set up heavy patrols around their base, but the Deathworlders knew how to move without being seen. They had trained for years to infiltrate enemy territory, and now their experience was paying off. They reached the command center without incident, but the real challenge was yet to come. The base was surrounded by heavy security, automated turrets, armed guards, and advanced surveillance systems. It was the kind of place that seemed impossible to breach. But Rena had a plan. The Deathworlders used their advanced tech to hack into the Torag's surveillance system, temporarily disabling the cameras and sensors around the base. While the Torag were unaware, the team moved in quickly, taking down guards silently and disabling the turrets one by one. The Deathworlders were methodical, careful not to make a sound as they advanced deeper into the base. Finally, they reached the command center. Rena gave the order, and the team planted explosives around the facility. They had to make sure the explosion would be enough to wipe out the entire base, cutting off the Torag's ability to communicate and plan their next move. As the explosives were set, Rena looked around at her team. The Deathworlders had been through so much already, and yet here they were, facing the most dangerous mission of all. "This is it," Rena said, her voice steady. "We hit them now, and they won't be able to recover." The countdown began. The team moved back into the jungle, blending into the shadows. The explosion rocked the night, sending a shockwave through the jungle. The Torag command center was destroyed, and with it, the heart of their war effort. As the Deathworlders made their way back to their camp, they knew the battle was far from over. But they had struck a decisive blow. The Torag would now have to fight without coordination, without leadership, and for the first time since the war began, the Deathworlders felt a glimmer of hope. They had turned the tide. The war was far from won, but the Deathworlders had shown the Torag that their victory was not guaranteed. The Xarnak were no longer alone in their fight. And now, with the command center in ruins, the Torag would learn that humanity was a force they could never break. The explosion that tore through the Torag's command center was only the beginning of their downfall. The Deathworlders had delivered a crushing blow, but they knew the Torag would not stay down for long. They were ruthless, and they would regroup, rebuild, and fight back with everything they had. The Deathworlders needed to stay one step ahead. Captain Rena gathered her team after the success of the attack. The mission had been a success, but it had also drawn attention. The Torag would now be aware that they were vulnerable. They would come at the Deathworlders with everything they could muster. "We've hit them hard, but we can't stop now," Rena said, her voice sharp. "We've taken out their leadership, but they're not finished yet. They'll be more determined than ever to retaliate. We need to keep the pressure on them." The team spent the next few days preparing for the inevitable Torag counterattack. They had dealt a severe blow, but the war was far from over. The Deathworlders couldn't afford to give the Tuareg any time to recover. They had to keep the momentum going. The Tuareg's response came sooner than expected. A massive army, more than double the size of their previous forces, began moving toward the Karnak capital. The Tuareg were angry, and they intended to crush the Deathworlders and Karnak once and for all. It was an all-out assault, and they didn't care how much damage they caused. Rena's team watched the massive Tuareg forces approach from a high vantage point. They could see the dust rising as the enemy marched forward, their war machines rumbling across the landscape. It was a terrifying sight, but the Deathworlders were not afraid. They had faced impossible odds before, and they had come out victorious. Now it was time to fight back once again. "We need to slow them down," Rena said, studying the enemy's movements. "We can't let them get to the city. If we do, it's over." The Deathworlders had already set up traps along the Tuareg's path. They had learned to use the jungle against the invaders, and now they would do it again. But this time, the stakes were higher. The Tuareg had learned from their previous mistakes. They were more cautious, more aware of the jungle's dangers. As the Tuareg advanced, the Deathworlders struck. They used hit-and-run tactics, attacking the enemy's supply lines and ambushing their smaller groups. They picked off the weaker, slower units first, making it difficult for the Tuareg to form a proper defense. But the Tuareg were no fools. They adapted quickly and began to fight back with more intensity. The Deathworlders knew they couldn't hold out forever. They were outnumbered, and the Tuareg's heavy firepower was overwhelming. But they also knew that they didn't need to defeat the Tuareg in a single battle. They needed to buy time, weaken the enemy, and force them to fight in ways they weren't prepared for. "We can't let them get complacent," Rena said, her eyes burning with determination. "Every victory, no matter how small, will add up. We've already taken their command center. Now we'll take their will to fight." The Deathworlders continued to strike and retreat, making the Tuareg chase them deeper into the jungle. They moved like shadows, attacking from unexpected angles, using the environment to their advantage. The Tuareg were becoming more frustrated, and with each passing hour, their morale began to slip. But the real turning point came when the Deathworlders lured a large group of Tuareg soldiers into a trap. The jungle was dense, and the Deathworlders knew how to use the terrain to isolate and destroy their enemies. With careful precision, they led the Tuareg into a narrow canyon, where the walls closed in and their heavy war machines couldn't maneuver. The Deathworlders ambushed them from both sides, catching the Tuareg completely off guard. The battle was fierce, but the Deathworlders' tactics were too much for the Tuareg to handle. By the time the enemy realized what had happened, they were already surrounded. Rena stood at the edge of the battlefield, watching the Tuareg retreat once again. "They're not invincible," she said, a smile creeping onto her face. "We're not done yet, but we've shown them they're not as powerful as they think." The Tuareg were shaken, but not broken. Despite the Deathworlders' repeated victories, the alien invaders continued to advance with a relentless fury. The Deathworlders knew that they could not afford to give the Tuareg another chance to regroup. The battle for Karnak had reached its most crucial point, and the Deathworlders needed to strike before the Tuareg could fully recover. Captain Rena's voice echoed through the comms as she addressed her team. "We've pushed them back every time, but now it's time to end this. The Tuareg are getting desperate. If we don't finish this soon, they will flood the planet with everything they have left." The team knew what had to be done. They had already delivered several crushing blows to the Tuareg's forces, but now they needed to deal the final blow. It wasn't enough to keep fighting smaller skirmishes. They had to take down the heart of the Tuareg war machine, their command base, which still had a backup leadership structure that could potentially revive their forces. Rena's plan was bold, but it was the only option. They would infiltrate the Tuareg's remaining stronghold and strike it from within. This time, they wouldn't just disable their communications or sabotage their supply lines. They would destroy the heart of the enemy's operation and force them to surrender. They set out at dawn, moving quickly and silently through the jungle. The Deathworlders knew that the Torag would be on high alert after the previous attacks, but they had an advantage. The Torag were too focused on retaliation to notice the subtle signs of a new strategy. The Deathworlders had learned to fight not just with their weapons, but with their minds. And this time, they were ready to outsmart the enemy once again. As they approached the Torag stronghold, the Deathworlders could see the massive fortress ahead. It was well guarded, with thick walls and powerful defenses, but it was not invincible. The team had already studied the terrain and found a weak point, a small entrance at the back of the compound, barely guarded and perfect for infiltration. We move in, strike fast, and take out the command center. The moment we hit them, they won't know what hit them, Rena said as she checked her equipment one last time. The team infiltrated the compound under the cover of darkness, moving like shadows through the heavy fortifications. The Torag soldiers patrolled the area, unaware of the danger lurking just beyond their line of sight. The Deathworlders struck quickly, taking out the guards with deadly precision and moving deeper into the heart of the stronghold. They reached the command center without being detected, but the hardest part was still ahead. The Torag had set up powerful defense systems to protect their leadership, and the Deathworlders needed to break through before the alarm was raised. "We have one shot at this," Rena said, her voice calm but focused. "Hit them hard. No mistakes." The team deployed explosives around the command center, carefully placing them in the most critical spots. With a final look at each other, they set the timers and quickly retreated to a safe distance. The explosion rocked the compound, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The Torag command center was destroyed, taking with it the heart of the enemy's operation. The Torag soldiers were thrown into chaos as their leadership crumbled. Rena watched from a distance as the fortress burned. "It's over," she said softly, a mix of relief and determination in her voice. "We've done it." But even as the Deathworlders celebrated their victory, they knew the war was not truly over. The Torag would not surrender without a fight, and they still had forces scattered across the planet. The Deathworlders had struck a decisive blow, but the final push to victory would come only when the last of the Torag invaders were driven from Sarnak once and for all. The dust had barely settled from the explosion that destroyed the Torag command center, but it was clear to everyone on Sarnak that this was the moment the war had been building up to. The Deathworlders, led by Captain Rena, had fought through countless battles and faced impossible odds. They had taken on an enemy that seemed invincible, and now, with the heart of the Torag war effort shattered, victory was within reach. But Rena knew better than to relax just yet. The Torag were still a powerful enemy, and though their command structure was in ruins, many of their forces were still scattered across the planet. It would take time to fully push the invaders off Sarnak. But for the first time, Rena allowed herself a moment of hope. "We've done it," she said, her voice quiet but filled with pride as she looked at her team. "But we can't stop now. The Torag may be weakened, but we finish this once and for all." The Deathworlders and their allies, the Sarnak, quickly rallied their forces for one last push. The Torag were reeling from the loss of their command, and now it was time to finish them off. The Deathworlders had learned to fight smarter, not just harder. They knew how to use the jungle, the terrain, and even the very creatures of the planet to their advantage. Rena gave the orders, and the forces advanced with precision. The Torag soldiers, who had once seemed unstoppable, were now scattered and disorganized. Without leadership, they were easy prey for the Deathworlders' relentless strikes. Small, quick raids tore through their remaining outposts, cutting them off from any reinforcements. Every battle, no matter how small, added up. The Torag had no time to recover, no time to regroup. They were forced into retreat, their morale shattered. The Deathworlders were closing in on the final victory. With each passing day, the Torag forces dwindled, and the Sarnak reclaimed their lands. Rena and her team led the charge, using their experience in battle to outsmart the Torag at every turn. The Deathworlders' tactics had proven too much for the invaders to handle. What the Torag had failed to understand was that humanity, with all its unpredictability and resourcefulness, was a force they could not defeat. As the final Torag strongholds fell, Rena stood at the edge of the battlefield, watching the retreating enemy. The jungle of Tarnak, which had once been a place of danger and uncertainty, was now a symbol of victory. The Deathworlders had turned the planet's harsh environment into a weapon, and the Torag had been caught in its fury. "The war is over," Rena said, her voice filled with a sense of accomplishment. "We've won." The Xarnak gathered around, celebrating their newfound freedom. They had fought alongside the Deathworlders, and now, with the Torag gone, they could finally begin to rebuild. The Deathworlders had given them the victory they had dreamed of for so long. And yet, Rena knew this victory was more than just a win for the Xarnak. It was a message to the galaxy. The Torag had underestimated humanity, and now they had learned the hard way that no one could invade a Deathworlder's home and expect to win. As Rena looked out over the horizon, she knew that this was only the beginning. Humanity's reputation had been forged in the fires of war, and the galaxy would never forget the strength of the Deathworlders. The universe had learned a lesson: never challenge a species that calls a Deathworld home.